So in section I on page 197 talks about access to the property. And what this is trying to get at is there a private road? Because if it's a private road, who has to maintain the road? Who's responsible for that, right? And there may be an agreement between several property owners, right? It could be that this one, maintenance of the road is up to that individual property owner. So if they buy the property, if the buyer buys the property, they're gonna be maintaining that road too. So I wanna make sure you understand about that. Is there a lease on the property? Can somebody buy a house that has a lease on it? Absolutely. You just transfer the lease to the new owner. But you have to make sure you got all your ducks in a row, because things like security deposits, all of that has to be dealt with. So that the rents, what if they've already, if they've already paid the rent for the next couple of months, you gotta make sure you've got all of those things worked out ahead of time. Talks about an FHA appraisal. If an FHA appraisal has been done in the last 4 months, and they check that box, then anybody that buys the property trying to get an FHA loan has to use that appraisal. Which is great if the appraisal is for as much as they're offering, but if it's significantly less, that can be a problem. Right? It's one of the reasons why you want to, when somebody makes an offer, they have to disclose what kind of loan they're hoping to get. Because if it's an FHA loan and it doesn't appraise, and then they terminate the contract, then that seller is stuck with that appraisal for 4 months. That's a pretty significant thing. So I want to make sure that we know about those appraisals. And she can just leave it on that desk there. Special assessments. What is a special assessment? Anybody know?
Sorry.
Has that made it around all the way around, or
On 100 of them.
skipped a couple?
Yeah.
Okay. Just make sure before you leave tonight that you want to get credit for being here. Have you seen it yet?
Yeah.
Okay. A special assessment. So the neighborhood decides to put in sidewalks, and everybody's going to pay $1,000 for each house to put these sidewalks into the neighborhood, right? It might be that that the seller pays that up front and it's already paid for, but they may also have like payments over time. And if they haven't paid it all off, you need to disclose that. Generally speaking, if there's a special assessment that's planned, that's already approved, then the seller has to pay that special assessment off. If it's a special assessment that's just being discussed, then the seller is not responsible for that. You can just leave it on. That's okay. So, manufactured or mobile home, you all know that if it's a manufactured home, it might not be real property. It could be personal property, right? In fact, I closed on a manufactured home this morning. And one of the things that the mortgage company required was that we have a structural engineer look underneath the house to make sure that it had a permanent foundation that was done properly and so forth. If it didn't, if it still was on wheels, then that would not be, they would not be eligible for the loan that they were getting. And so you have to check all that out. Is there a fuel tank? Especially want to know if it's a buried fuel tank, right? And who owns the fuel tank? Any of you have a propane tank outside your house? No? You do? Yeah, sometimes people that are, especially if you're out in the county someplace, you don't have a natural gas line to the house, you have a propane tank. And sometimes those propane tanks are owned and sometimes they're leased. And so if they're leased and the buyer thinks that it goes with the house and they show up and there's no propane tank and it's the middle of winter and there's no heat to the house, that can be a problem, right? So you want to make sure all that's lined out when you list the property, that there's no surprises. You know what's leased and what's owned and how much is owed and all that sort of thing. And then it talks about the seller's duties. So the seller has duties in this relationship too. They're going to fill out various forms, like the residential property disclosure form. Have you all gone over that before? You've been introduced to the residential property disclosure? The residential property disclosure is on page 231. Look at page 231. The first page is just the instructions. If you look at page 231, it talks about how to fill out the form. But turn to the second page. On the second page, it starts a list of a whole bunch of questions. In what year was the dwelling constructed? Is there any problem, malfunction, or defect with the dwelling's foundation, slab, fireplace, chimneys, floors, etc.? And for most of these, you have three choices. You can answer, yes, there is a problem, malfunction, or defect. No, there is no problem, malfunction, or defect. Or no representation, which means I ain't saying one way or another. And so the seller can choose to check no representation for all of these. Even what year was the dwelling constructed? I don't know. I'm saying one way or another. They can just check no representation. What I generally tell sellers is, if you've been living in the house and you know about the house, go ahead and answer the questions, yes or no. If you honestly don't know, you can check no representation. If you inherited the house and you never lived in the house, put no representation because you don't know. If you have been renting the house for 5 years and you really hadn't been in the house very much, maybe checking no representation is the best way to go. But most sellers, if they answer the questions, the buyers are going to feel like they've gotten a fair shake. If they just put no representation, the sellers have lived there for 20 years, you're going to think, what are they hiding? You know? But it's certainly within their right to answer no representation. Number 32, which is on page 233, it asks, is there a homeowners association? And essentially, if they put yes, then they have to answer the questions that follow that. That all of the following questions have to do with a homeowners association. So are there any fees charged by the association? Is there a lawsuit? You know, all those kinds of questions. And then number 37 on page 234 is a list of all the amenities that the homeowners association covers. So management fees, exterior maintenance, common area maintenance, trash removal. Is that a yes, no, or I ain't saying? So that's the residential property disclosure. Does the homeowner have to fill this out? Yes. Even if it's a for sale by owner, they're required to fill out the residential property disclosure. Do they have to tell anything? No. They can put no representation. Look at the next page. This is the next disclosure, the mineral, oil, and gas rights mandatory disclosure statement. It's on page 235. Notice here, you have 6 lines where they're going to disclose something. The first one says, mineral rights were severed from the property by a previous owner. So you can say yes or no representation here. Most people put no representation. They don't know whether somebody else has severed the mineral rights. But the next two, the seller has severed the mineral rights from the property. They can't put no representation. They have to say whether they have severed the mineral rights or not. And the next one, seller intends to sever the mineral rights. And then the same three questions for oil and gas rights. This came up because a builder in East North Carolina, and also in Greensboro for that matter, in the Triad area actually, was selling property, selling a whole subdivision, and they had their own offer to purchase and contract. And somewhere in that offer to purchase and contract was some little fine print that said that they are keeping the oil and gas rights underneath the land, so that they could go in later and frack underneath this neighborhood and pull the gas out from it. And the thing is that most people didn't read all that fine print. And so they didn't know that they were buying this property and they didn't get the oil and gas rights with it. And that somebody was gonna put an oil derrick up, just outside the neighborhood and come underneath their property. So some homeowners got wind of it and raised heck about it. And so the North Carolina legislature said, if somebody's gonna sell property, they need to disclose whether they're keeping the mineral oil and gas rights.
Do they give the rights back to the homeowners?
Yes, I believe that they did. I believe they went back and gave them back their mineral rights. So they gotta fill all that out. There's also the lead-based page. We talked about that when we were talking about hazards. They gotta tell whether they've got any reports, whether they have any knowledge of lead-based paint. Restrictive covenants, bylaws, all those kinds of things. This, on page 196, or 198 rather. It goes on to talk about various things that the seller is going to provide. Seller authorizes any attorney presently or previously representing seller to release and disclose any title insurance policy. That helps the buyer so that they don't have to start from, scratch with title. So they don't have to go back 30 years. They can look at the old title insurance, which might go back 10 years, and start there. Owners association managers and so forth, they can get information. And then section E, near the top of the page, executing and delivering at settlement a general warranty deed conveying fee simple marketable title to the property. So we're basically saying they can sell the property and give a general warranty deed. The seller, it goes on, the next little paragraph says seller represents that the seller has the right to convey the property and that there are currently no circumstances that would prohibit the seller from conveying fee simple marketable title as set forth in the preceding sentence, except as follows. So if there's something that might get in the way, they need to put that down there. Section 14 has to do with home inspections. Maybe they might get a home inspection. I guess I didn't put that in there. Sometimes sellers will get a pre-inspection before they list the property. I tell them if it would give you peace of mind, because you haven't been under your house in 30 years, to have somebody take a look. That's probably a good idea. We already talked about photographs and other things. Additional terms, dual agency. So, we did talk about dual agency, did I get past, I don't know why I skipped over the furnace money. The thing is, most people think if the buyer defaults or they terminate the contract after the due diligence date, that the seller's gonna get the earnest money. But the contract actually reads that it'll be split between the firm and the seller. Now, most firms are a little squishy on this, and maybe they'll give the seller the earnest money if as long as they're continuing to list with the same firm. But it is something to be thinking about. So dual agency, there's a whole section in there about dual agency to make sure that you have permission. And here it is on page 199, where you see those little blanks. The seller has to initial. The seller authorizes the firm to act as a dual agent. So that's where you're gonna get that dual agency permission up front. But the next line says, seller desires exclusive representation at all times during this agreement and does not authorize the firm to act in the capacity as a dual agent. If you're with a big firm, this is a big pain if they wanna initial that, because you won't be able to show it to any agent within your firm, including yourself. And then, designated agent option, this would give, the seller would give authorization to act as a designated agent. Next section is about mediation. If there's a dispute, the seller agrees to mediation before resorting to arbitration, litigation, or some other dispute resolution procedure, and that they will share the cost of the mediation equally. And then the last thing is that that the entire agreement, there's no under the table stuff. Seller and the firm each acknowledge receipt of a signed copy of this agreement, so everybody knows what's involved. And of course they sign that. Look at the signature. So we have the seller, print their name, signature, date, information. And then about halfway down on page 200, it says entity seller. So if it's a company that's selling, maybe it's XYZ Inc., and then by Wayne Young, CEO. So that's where you would use if it's something other than a person that's selling the property. And then a little farther along, you see the real estate firm's name and the individual agent's signature and license number. The newest copies of this listing agreement also has the firm's license number that you have to put in there as well. And then the contact information for everybody. So, let's talk a little bit about square footage. Square footage is not a material fact, but when we go into the MLS, people want to know how much square footage there is in the house, right? How big is the house? Well, it's about 1,400 square feet. Gives them at least, one idea of how big the house is. So we're talking about heated living area. This is the living area heated by the primary heating system. So a little space heater that's plugged into the wall or something, you can't count that space if it's not heated, by a normal heating system. Now, some houses have space heaters that are, you have a little thermostat on the wall, and each room has its own little heating system. So you can turn off half the house and only heat the part of the house that you're living in. But you can't count a little space heater as heated square footage. And this happens a lot when people add on to the house themselves. They'll add on a sunroom, for instance, and the sunroom has a big opening to the living room. And of course, the living room is heated, and they'll say, well, the air just flows from the living room into the sunroom and keeps it cool or keeps it hot. But if you've ever been in a sunroom that didn't have heating or cooling, you know that it can differ significantly from the rest of the house if it's not heated square footage. So you got to be careful about that. Basements, especially, where they finish a basement when it wasn't finished before, stuff like that. When Jan had her post-licensing class, she asked if she could send her class to one of my listings to measure the house, and they had never measured a house before. And this was a 3-story house, I really didn't think about the fact that they hadn't ever measured a house before. Well, the fact is, what we do is we use an exterior measurement. So let's say this is just a plain rectangular brick house, or whatever house. In order to find the square footage, you would measure this measurement here. Let's say that's 20 feet. Well, that's small for a house, I guess, isn't it? And that's 10 feet, just to make it easy. So 10 times 20 is 200. That's 200 square feet. That would be the heated square footage. Okay, so we count, even though there's walls, we count that as part of the heated square footage. You're going to get into the details of this later on, but what they were doing is they were measuring each room when they first got there and adding up all the square footages of all those rooms. And I can tell you from experience that's a really hard way to measure a house, because then you got to add on the wall, for each room and all of that. So if you can measure the outside, it's a whole lot easier. Now it becomes, more difficult if you have a house that's a 2-story house, and the second floor is smaller than the first floor, because you can't get to that outside of that second floor. And so you would measure the outside of the first floor by walking around the house and measuring that. But when it comes to the second floor, you might have to go inside and measure the inside dimensions, and then add the, well, this is not the right thing, but anyway, let's do this. You have to measure the inside dimensions, forget the height of the house, and add the wall thickness to your measurements. So you're pretending like you were standing on the outside of the house measuring. Does that make sense? I thought it was kind of... If it's a condo, the condo, you own basically the skin on the paint inside the house, right? You don't own the walls, because it's considered common area. And so you just own what's inside that space. So you wouldn't count that. A townhouse, you might have a shared wall, with somebody, so you split that. But the outside wall on the end, if you were on the end of a townhouse project, you would count that outside wall. I'm not gonna go into too much detail there. So how do we come up with the price of a property? The fact is, we don't decide how much a house is gonna list for, the seller decides that, but we're gonna help them by providing some information. So we're gonna provide them with a comparative market analysis. So we're gonna pull up houses that have sold with as many similarities as possible. The ideal comparables would be in the same neighborhood, the same size house, same square footage, same number of bedrooms and bathrooms and all that. That's the same garage. But I can tell you from experience, it's very rare that you have that situation. Even if you have houses made with the same model, in other words, the same layout, there'd be slight differences. So maybe one house, the people took really good care of it and they made improvements to it, and another house with the same layout is just a big mess. So, you know, you have to look at the pictures in the MLS. That's why they store all that in the MLS, so we can go back and look at them. It's not an appraisal. We're trying to figure out an approximate sales price to help the seller decide what to list it for, but it's not an appraisal. We're going to provide a net proceeds sheet, which we're going to estimate all their expenses. I think I can pull this up. No, I can't. Let me see here. I'll try to grab a net proceeds sheet for you real quick here. I know you're not going to be able to see all these numbers, but this is a Excel spreadsheet that I use. And I've got the formulas in it for the things that change. So for instance, this is a piece of land, and we're going to list it for $50,000. And if we get $50,000, that's 100% of the list price. They're going to pay about $200 to the attorney to prepare the deed. They're going to pay excise tax of $2 per thousand or $1 per 500. Have you all talked about that yet? Okay.
Always round up.
So that'll be $100 if they sell it for $50,000. The sales commission was 8% on this particular property, so it's going to be $4,000 for that. And then the current property tax is $541, and they owe some past taxes. So we got to pay that off, $7,000. In this case, I use the same sort of spreadsheet for single-family homes as well. In those cases, we might have a redecorating allowance, or we might offer closing costs. We might offer a home warranty. But when I give the seller this, when we're listing, I'm going to estimate, well, what if we get a little bit less than 100% of the list price? What if I get $45,000 instead of $50,000? And some of these things are going to change based on the percentage. So 8% of 45,000 is 3,600 instead of 4,000. And so, but the things that don't change would be things like the taxes. So I just created this spreadsheet, and when I list a property, I'll give that to the seller so they know that they're going to end up with a certain amount of money. So down at the very bottom, it says that the net to the seller will be $38,000 if we sell it for that list price of $50,000. If we get a little bit less, it's going to be less. I use the same spreadsheet when it goes under contract. So, or rather when we get an offer. So in this column, this is list price. And this column might be the offer that the buyer has made. And this is how much you're gonna net from that offer. And this column, I might put a proposed counteroffer. So we listed it for 50,000, they offered 40,000, this would be the net that you get from 40,000, and I'm gonna suggest that we counter at 48,000. And this is what you'd net from that. So this is a good way to show the sellers what they're gonna end up with. Now this is a real simple example here. Sometimes, you know, you have deals, they're asking for closing costs, or they're asking for you to pay for a home warranty. The home warranty might be, I had a offer recently where the buyer wanted a 2-year home warranty, which was over $1,000. It was like $1,100 for a 2-year home warranty. So, you know, I had to put that in the spreadsheet to show the seller what they were gonna end up with. And I always tell the seller, you know, you don't need to worry about whether you're given closing costs or a home warranty or what it is. What you need to be focused on is this net, what's your bottom line. Because whether you lower the price by $1,000 or you give a $1,000 home warranty, it's gonna be about the same for you. Sometimes sellers get all hung up. They're like, why should I pay the buyer's closing costs? Nobody ever paid my closing costs. I have to explain to them. We already talked about termination of agency, so I'm not going to go over that again. We talked through the property disclosure. We already looked at the property disclosure, but I want to point out that not everybody has to fill out a property disclosure. You can, if it's new construction, they don't have to do property disclosure. Foreclosures, rent-own situations, or if everybody says, well, we're just not going to bother with it, if both parties agree not to complete that. More importantly, though, you can't fill it out for your client. They've got to do that. And it must be given to the buyer no later than the time the buyer makes an offer on the property. And that's so that they can make a reasonable offer, right? If there's a whole bunch of problems, they need to know that up front. But if the disclosure is not delivered, then the purchaser can cancel or rescind any contract. But if you give them, if you don't give them this property disclosure after the 3rd day after they've received it, they lose that right to cancel. Or the end of the 3rd day following the contract date, they lose that right to cancel. Or if they actually purchase the property, they lose their right to cancel. Or with a lease with option to purchase when they sell it. We talked about the mineral oil and gas. Basically, any sales subject to the property disclosure. First sale for new construction. Here, that's a difference. So you don't have to do a property disclosure statement for new construction, but you do have to do a mineral oil and gas. So those builders that were trying to hoodwink buyers, they have to do the mineral oil and gas. We call this the MOG, M-O-G disclosure log.
If the lot is vacant, do you have to still do it?
If it's what?
Vacant?
Yes, absolutely. A vacant property is just the same as a occupied property. Interesting though, they don't have to do a mineral oil and gas disclosure for vacant land. So if it's just pure land, it's not required, which is kind of weird when you think about it. Notice again that you can put no representation for a previous owner, but all the others have no opportunity to put no representation. We talked about the lead paint addendum before. The addendum is required for any home built prior to what year? 1978. And who has to sign the lead-based paint addendum? Everybody. The buyer, the seller, the buyer's agent, and the seller's agent all have to sign the lead-based paint addendum. And you gotta give that brochure, the Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, to the buyer. Usually the buyer's agent will provide that. I want to take just a minute to talk about buyer agency. On page 202, you can see the exclusive buyer agency agreement. Much of this is very similar to the listing agent contract. Again, we have to talk about working with real estate agency and discuss agency and so forth. Compensation, we've talked about the fact that it often does not come from the buyer. It usually comes from the seller. If they decide to do seller sub-agency, they're not going to be filling out this form. They're going to check that little box on the working with real estate agents that says that they agree to have their person work as a seller sub-agent. And they initial that on the working with real estate agents. If the buyer will not authorize buyer agency or seller sub-agency, then you just have to tell them goodbye. Because you can't work for nobody, you have to work for somebody. There are several types of buyer's agency, just as there were several types of listing contracts. A non-exclusive buyer agency, basically they can work with anybody they want to. Non-exclusive. This is, of course, what a verbal buyer's agency, but you could actually have a written non-exclusive buyer agency agreement. I don't know why you would want to do that. You can have oral buyer agency, which you've talked about. You've talked about compensation and dual agency and the fact that it's non-exclusive and there's no termination date. But it must be reduced in writing before you make an offer. That's right. And going from seller sub-agent to buyer agent, why would this be strongly discouraged? I've decided that I want to work with you as a buyer agent instead of a seller sub-agent. Why would the commission say this is a really bad idea?
Because it's very possible that you wanted confidential information about the seller at that time.
Yeah, when you were working for the seller as a seller sub-agent, you've already told the seller everything about this buyer, right? Because you were a seller sub-agent. You were working for the seller. And now they turn around and say, well, I want you to work for me exclusively. You got a problem. You can do it, but you have to explain to them, well, I've already told them these things about you. You just won the lottery and you have more money than God, I told them. But the most common form of buyer's agency is the exclusive buyer agency agreement, which we have in our book here, the gold standard. Only one agency represents the buyer, and all the agents in the firm are part of that, and the buyer may be required to pay a success fee. I've talked about qualifying the buyer. I don't actually, I know that for the sake of your testing, you're gonna have to learn how to qualify a buyer, at least to some degree. But practically speaking, we don't have to do a bunch of math to figure out whether they would qualify for the loan. Most of the time today, I hand them over to a mortgage company and say, get a letter from the mortgage company that you are pre-qualified for that loan. And make sure that you get all that. You're still gonna prepare a CMA when they find a house that they like, and help them to put together that offer and assist them as the deal goes through, and eventually to close. So you're gonna maybe find them an attorney to do the closing. You'll find them a home inspector and a termite inspector, and maybe do radon tests and all of that sort of thing. You wanna make sure that you have all of that. If you're working with a buyer's agent or with a buyer and you bring them to a FSBO, we've already talked about how we deal with that protection agreement. Same thing with a seller working with a limited service broker. You might have to work some of that out. Sometimes you're working for both sides to some degree with like a limited service or a FSBO. You might have to do more work because of it. Talked about that. Most of the time, these days, we use a showing service, so you make your appointment, make sure that the listing agent knows whether you're working as a seller sub-agent or a buyer's agent. And make sure that if it's a FSBO that you have requested compensation. Whenever I show buyers houses, I always like to tell them, this is not my house. So tell me what you think, right? You won't hurt my feelings if you don't like it. As the agent though, I have to remind myself to keep my mouth shut, because when I walk into a house and it's really ugly, my first inclination, when I first went into business, I'd walk in and go, oh my God, this is awful. Can you believe they painted these walls puke yellow? That is terrible. And then they go, this is just like my grandma's house. It's perfect. And you just feel like an idiot. So you got to make sure that you discover and disclose all material facts, and that you've come up with an appropriate offering price. And you're going to prepare that contract, which you'll discuss in Unit 9, and get everything ready for closing so that they can get ready to go. So one last math problem to see if you're still awake. So house is worth $200,000, that's your sales price, and it's got a 6% commission, split 50-50 with the buyer's agent, and the listing agent is on a 70% split. How much is the listing agent going to take home? If you get it right, you can go.
1,800. $4,200 is the 70% that the firm gets.
Okay, so they get the remainder of that.
Right.
So the total commission is the sale price times the commission rate, right? So 200 times 6%.
12.
The co-brokerage split is the total commission times the co-broke percent, 50-50. The agent split is the co-broke split times the agent percent. So let's see how that works. 200,000 times 6% is
12 grand.
12,000. Who gets that check?
The firm?
The firm, the listing firm, right? Okay. Does it always split evenly?
No.
No. So 50-50 split, they're gonna be 6,000, half of that goes to the listing firm. And the listing broker's commission's gonna be 70% of that, so 0.70 times 6,000 is a total of 4,200. If you got that right, you can go home. Have a great night. I won't be back for a week or so, and I get to talk with you about the riveting discussion of mortgage financing or something like that. But thank you so much for your attention this last week.
Thank you.
I hope I didn't bore you to death. I know this stuff is tough.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne.
And by the way, if you need the slides, feel free to email me. I'll be glad to put my email address up on the board.